The Daystar television network, a powerhouse in Christian broadcasting with millions of devoted viewers worldwide, finds itself embroiled in a controversy that strikes at the very heart of its founding principles. What began as a private family matter has exploded into public scrutiny, revealing deep fractures within the leadership of this influential ministry. At the center of this storm lies a deathbed revelation that has been systematically ignored, raising profound questions about integrity, legacy, and the true cost of maintaining power in religious institutions. Before we dive into this explosive revelation, don't forget to hit that like button if you stand for truth, comment accountability below with your thoughts, and subscribe because this story is still developing with shocking new details emerging daily. The story begins in the final days of Marcus Lamb's life. As the charismatic co-founder of Daystar lay in his hospital bed, surrounded by the faint beeping of monitors and the hushed whispers of family, he made a decision that would send shockwaves through his ministry. With time running out, Marcus placed an urgent call to Denise Boggs, a trusted family friend who had stood by the Lambs through decades of ministry highs and lows. His voice, though weakened by illness, carried an unmistakable urgency as he instructed her, "Miss Denise, I need you to write this down exactly as I say it." What followed wasn't merely a dying man's ramblings, but a meticulously planned succession blueprint for the $200 million empire he had built from the ground up. Marcus's vision was crystal clear. He named his son Jonathan as the rightful heir to Daystar's leadership, describing him as the first lamb who must step in and carry things on. This wasn't a passing mention. Marcus laid out an entire leadership structure with Jonathan at its center. Susie Lamb, Jonathan's wife, was designated as his primary support. Marcus's daughters Rachel Lamb Brown and Rebecca Lamb Wise were assigned key roles, with Rebecca specifically tasked with holding up Jonathan's arms in the biblical tradition of Aaron supporting Moses. The imagery was intentional and deeply symbolic, drawing from Exodus where Aaron and Hur held up Moses' arms during battle to ensure victory for Israel. Marcus was clearly framing Jonathan's leadership as a spiritual battle that would require family unity. But the most telling detail in Marcus's final instructions wasn't who he included, it was who he conspicuously omitted. Joshua Brown, Rachel's husband and a prominent figure in Daystar's current leadership structure, wasn't mentioned once in Marcus's detailed succession plan. This glaring absence speaks volumes, especially considering Joshua now occupies a position of significant influence within the network. Denise Boggs, though she noticed the omission immediately, chose not to question Marcus about it in his fragile state. She later shared the document with Joni Lamb and the couple's daughters, assuming they would honor Marcus's final wishes. What happened next would shock even those familiar with the inner workings of televangelism's often complicated power structures. The depth of Marcus's conviction about Jonathan's leadership becomes even more apparent when we examine years of private prayers the ministry founder recorded about his son. In these emotionally raw audio clips, Marcus's voice cracks with paternal pride and spiritual longing as he petitions God to prepare Jonathan for leadership. "Thank you from the bottom of my heart for bringing Jonathan into my life," Marcus prays in one particularly moving recording. "He has been such a wonderful son and such a godly Christian young man." The prayers continue with Marcus asking for divine protection over Jonathan's family, wisdom in decision-making, and favor in ministry. Most strikingly, Marcus specifically asks God to help Jonathan resist the temptation to depend on Daystar's resources rather than divine provision, a request that now seems prophetic given recent events. Marcus's spiritual assessment of Jonathan stands in stark contrast to how some within Daystar's current leadership circles view him. Critics have dismissed Jonathan as too meek for leadership, a characterization that Marcus himself directly addressed through biblical precedent. He frequently compared Jonathan to Moses, who Scripture describes as the meekest man on all the earth, Numbers 12:3, yet was chosen by God to liberate an entire nation from slavery. This parallel wasn't accidental. Marcus saw in Jonathan the same quiet strength that made Moses effective, a willingness to listen before speaking, to follow God's lead rather than personal ambition, and to prioritize spiritual integrity over organizational growth. These qualities, which Marcus spent years nurturing in his son through prayer and mentorship, have now become the very reasons Jonathan finds himself exiled from the ministry his father built. The question that haunts every observer of this unfolding drama is simple yet profound. Why was Marcus's clear vision for succession so completely disregarded? The answers emerging paint a complex picture of grief, power dynamics, and institutional preservation. In the immediate aftermath of Marcus's passing, Joni Lamb found herself thrust into sole leadership of a global ministry while simultaneously navigating unimaginable personal loss. Those close to the situation describe a grieving widow leaning heavily on Joshua Brown's more assertive leadership style during this vulnerable period. Where Jonathan might have taken time to mourn and seek spiritual direction before making major decisions, Joshua reportedly moved quickly to stabilize operations and reassure stakeholders. This decisive approach, while potentially necessary in the short term, appears to have permanently altered Daystar's leadership trajectory. Compounding this dynamic were long-standing family tensions that Marcus's death brought to the surface. Multiple sources describe heated disagreements between Jonathan and his siblings about Daystar's future direction, with Jonathan advocating for a more measured approach to expansion and others pushing for aggressive growth. These philosophical differences, manageable while Marcus lived, became irreconcilable fractures in his absence. The result was an organizational coup that saw Jonathan and Susie systematically removed from positions of influence while Joshua and his allies consolidated power. The speed and completeness of this transition suggests it was anything but accidental, a calculated reshaping of Daystar's leadership that flew directly in the face of Marcus's expressed wishes. The fallout from this power shift has been both personal and institutional. Former employees describe a climate of fear and suspicion at Daystar headquarters, with staff divided into factions supporting either Jonathan or Joshua. Longtime donors have begun quietly withdrawing support, troubled by the ethical implications of disregarding a founder's dying wishes. Perhaps most damaging has been the erosion of trust among Daystar's viewer base, many of whom built their connection to the ministry on Marcus's personal charisma and spiritual authenticity. When the very leaders who preach about honoring gods will appear to have ignored their own patriarch's final instructions, it creates cognitive dissonance that no amount of polished programming can overcome. Jonathan and Susie's response to this betrayal has been notably restrained. Unlike corporate executives who might wage public battles for control, they've chosen quiet dignity over confrontation. This silence shouldn't be mistaken for surrender. It reflects both Jonathan's genuine humility and a calculated understanding that in matters of spiritual leadership, the moral high ground often proves more powerful than temporary positions of authority. Their absence from Daystar's broadcasts speaks louder than any press release ever could, creating an elephant in the room that grows more conspicuous with each passing week. Denise Boggs's decision to come forward with Marcus's deathbed instructions has added jet fuel to this simmering controversy. By making public what was intended as a private family document, she's forced a conversation Daystar's current leadership would clearly prefer to avoid. Marcus knew exactly what he was doing in those final hours, Denise recently stated. He wasn't confused or manipulated. He was ensuring his life's work would continue according to God's calling, not human ambition. This framing cuts to the heart of why this story resonates far beyond internal ministry politics. It's become a referendum on whether religious institutions can maintain spiritual integrity while operating like secular corporations. The implications of this crisis extend well beyond one family or one television network. At its core, this is a story about what happens when the spiritual and the institutional collide, when the legacy of a founder comes into conflict with the practical realities of maintaining a multimillion-dollar organization. Daystar's dilemma mirrors challenges facing countless religious movements throughout history. How to remain true to founding principles while adapting to changing circumstances, how to balance human leadership with divine calling, how to handle succession in institutions built around charismatic figures. What makes this particular situation so poignant is the existence of that deathbed document, a clear, unambiguous expression of the founder's wishes that has been treated more like an inconvenient suggestion than a sacred trust. The contrast between Marcus's heartfelt prayers for Jonathan and Jonathan's current marginalization creates a narrative tension that demands resolution. Either Daystar's current leadership believes they know better than their founder about what the ministry needs, or they've prioritized institutional preservation over spiritual obedience. Neither explanation reflects well on an organization that claims to operate under divine guidance. As this situation continues to unfold, several key questions remain unanswered. Will Joni Lamb have a change of heart and move to reconcile with Jonathan? Will mounting public pressure force Daystar's leadership to address the succession issue directly? Might Jonathan eventually break his silence and tell his side of the story? And most importantly, can Daystar recover from this crisis of confidence with its spiritual credibility intact? The answers to these questions will determine whether Daystar can transition from being Marcus Lamb's ministry to a lasting institution with its founding values intact, or whether it will become yet another cautionary tale about how power corrupts even the most well-intentioned religious organizations. What began as a private family matter has blossomed into a very public test of whether a Christian media empire can practice what it preaches when the cameras are off and difficult decisions must be made. The conclusion of this matter may take years to fully play out, but the lessons are already becoming clear. First, that no ministry is immune to the corrupting influence of power and money, no matter how pure its beginnings. Second, that spiritual legitimacy cannot be maintained through production values and viewership numbers alone. It requires consistency between public teaching and private conduct. And third, that the true measure of a religious leader isn't how they perform on camera, but how they handle succession, whether they build institutions that can outlive them without betraying their core principles. For now, Daystar continues broadcasting its message of hope and faith to millions worldwide. But behind the scenes, the network faces its most serious challenge not from external critics or changing media landscapes, but from its own failure to honor the vision of the man who started it all. How this crisis resolves, whether through reconciliation, reformation, or continued denial, will write the next chapter not just in Daystar's history, but in the broader conversation about accountability in Christian media. The story of Marcus Lamb's deathbed revelation and its aftermath serves as a sobering reminder that in religious leadership, the most dangerous threats often come not from outside opposition, but from internal compromise. It raises uncomfortable questions about how many other ministries might be ignoring their founding principles in pursuit of growth and influence. And it challenges viewers and supporters to hold religious media accountable not just for the quality of its programming, but for the integrity of its leadership. As we await further developments in this ongoing saga, one truth remains self-evident. Marcus Lamb built Daystar on a foundation of faith and family, and his final act was an attempt to secure that foundation for generations to come. That his wishes were so thoroughly disregarded speaks volumes about how far the ministry has drifted from its roots. Whether it can find its way back may well determine whether Daystar survives as anything more than another cautionary tale about what happens when religious institutions value self-preservation above spiritual obedience. What do you think should happen next? Should Jonathan Lamb be reinstated to honor his father's dying wish? Or has Daystar moved beyond its founding family? Comment your perspective below, like if you believe in accountability for religious organizations, and subscribe for continuing coverage of this developing story. The conversation about faith, power, and integrity in religious media is just beginning. Make sure your voice is part of it.